Alright, looks like we're coming in good. So, hello everyone. We are finally back for our first video of May. I didn't do one last week because of how things worked out, and it just got all busy last week, so we just went ahead and delayed a week, which I don't think we've actually taken a week's break in a video in a little while, so it might have done us some good. So, as I mentioned with the last video here, with James A. Garfield was the last one that we did, I mentioned that the two next presidents that we had really were kind of right hand on hand with each other. They were kind of something that I thought needed to be discussed pretty much back to back instead of waiting another month, just because of how close these two presidents end up lining up with each other. So that is what we're going to hit today. So for the purpose of today, we're going to hit another president, and then we'll move on from them until at least late June will be the next time we do another one. At least that's the plan, because late June, I will actually be going on vacation for a week, so we'll see how that works. But it will at least be in June by the time we do another one of these. But for the president for today that we're moving on to is what was James Garfield's vice president, but then assumed the presidency upon his assassination in 1881, and that is Mr. Chester Alan Arthur, or Chester Arthur as we'll call him. We won't mention the middle name too much. So Chester Arthur was born on, and I don't know if anyone else is perturbed by this, but he has probably one of the most eloquent facial hairstyles I've seen any president. I've never seen another president that has the facial hair that this man does. I've never seen another man that has that. But anyway, back to the point. Chester Arthur was born on October 5th, 1829, in Fairfield, Vermont. His father was William Arthur, who was a Baptist minister from Ireland, and his mother, Malvina Stone Arthur, was from Vermont natively. So she married an Irish immigrant, and they ended up having Chester. Chester, I believe, did have a sister. Yes, I believe Mary, I believe was her name, because she ended up acting as her brother's hostess during his White House years, since his wife had unfortunately passed away years before, so she very much acted in the place of a first lady for her brother during his time at the White House. Chester was born into this family in upstate New York, not upstate New York, but Vermont. They moved to upstate New York shortly after he was born. It was very early in his childhood, and the family nickname for him was Chet. Everyone in the family called him Chet. They didn't call him Chester, they called him Chet. That was the nickname they had for him. The family had moved to upstate New York shortly after his birth, partly due for William's work. William, of course, being an Irish immigrant, back then there was a lot of discrimination toward immigrants in general, especially those from Ireland at the time, because there was quite a bunch of them coming over right around the early 19th century, and at the time there was still much discrimination toward Irish immigrants, and that probably influenced where William could find work, and if that required him to move him and his family out of Vermont to go find it, then he probably definitely would have to pursue that option, which he did. Chester attended Union College in Schenectady, New York, and he graduated from there in 1848, so by the time he was 19, which is actually quite young to be graduating from college. I don't know that many 19-year-olds that graduate from college. Many of them are just beginning. Arthur would become a school teacher, and he studied law at the State and National Law School in Ballston Spa, New York. He would serve as principal of schools in North Pownell, Vermont, and Cohoes, New York in the 1850s, and eventually he was admitted to the New York Bar in 1854 and began practicing law in New York City, and that is where Arthur is going to start getting in his politics. It was very common practice that if you got involved in the law and the legal field, it was just going to evolve from there, or that somehow you were going to get involved in the political sphere, as we've seen with many of these presidents over and over again. Very shortly after they pursue a career in law and get admitted to their state bars, they very quickly get wrapped up in the politics and political ass-goings of whatever city or town that they ended up setting up their law practice in. Speaking of, I believe, yes, this right here, we have a picture of Arthur. It's a little black, though, of Arthur when he actually was a lawyer during his youth. Looks very much different from this portrait of a much elder man in some ways. And like Garfield, Arthur is probably not one of our very fondly remembered presidents. Not due to any badness that he did. I mean, he actually was quite surprising, which we'll get to, but I think this dude, he's just not been a very memorable president. The name alone kind of sticks alone. I mean, I can't recall anyone else ever having the unique name of Chester Arthur becoming president, but we've had plenty of James, we have plenty of Williams, we even have like 3 Georges, but and even 2 Franklins, but Chester Arthur is a unique name, and I think at the same time, because his presidency was kind of right on the heels, and again, what many people saw as a filling out for his predecessor, many people just didn't really, I think, cling to his memory a whole lot when they thought of memorable presidents. In 1859, Arthur would marry Ellen Nell, or Nell, as they like to call her, that was the nickname for her, Ellen Lewis Herndon, and she was the daughter of a Virginia naval officer. Mind you, this is before the Civil War. They ended up having 2 children who survived to adulthood: Chester Arthur Jr., who was born in 1864, and Ellen Herndon Arthur, who would be born in 1871. Nell ended up dying in 1880 at the age of 42 of pneumonia. She ended up passing away the year of the presidential election that got Arthur and Garfield into the White House. So she did not live to see her husband take office as vice president, and she did not live long enough to see him take office as president upon the assassination of Garfield. Arthur would begin his political career in New York City. He won several high-profile civil rights cases as a young attorney there, and in 1855, Arthur would successfully represent Elizabeth Jennings Graham, who was an African-American woman who had been denied a seat on a Manhattan streetcar due to her race, which this kind of sounds eerily similar to roughly 100 years or so down the road with Rosa Parks, who had been asked to move down from her seat and move to the back of the bus because she was black. Now, this is not the same pretext, where in this case, the African American woman was entirely said, nope, you can't be on the streetcar at all. Instead of, no, you can sit in the back. No, this wasn't segregation. This was, keep in mind, this might have been in the North. Slavery did not exist in the North. But, well, I take that back. It existed in a couple states like Delaware, and maybe, I don't know if you really want to consider Maryland the North, but I do consider Delaware the North. But like Delaware still had it. But although slavery largely is gone in the North, they're still beholden to many of the prejudices and racial biases that plague the South, and in some cases, it's just as bad. There are plenty of people in the North that will come to a head here in the Civil War that pretty much, although they were not for the South leaving the Union and they were fighting to preserve the Union in that respect, they were not willing to really fight for the freedom of slaves because they were in many ways just as racist as their Southern cousins. It was the common attitude at the time nationwide that there was this common prejudice belief that somehow African Americans and other people of other ethnicities were somehow lesser beings and lesser human beings than a white man or a white woman. And that was not just in the South, that was everywhere in the nation. It just happened to be in the South that on top of that belief, they also had the institution of slavery. But in this case, in 1855, Arthur ended up representing this African American woman in her case, and he actually won it for her. It helped to desegregate the public transportation in the city, which was a big win for Arthur in his legal career. He was also involved in the 1860 Lemon slave case that ended up seeing the New York State Supreme Court rule that slaves being transferred to a slave state through New York could and would be freed. So keep in mind, there is the whole Underground Railroad thing going on that is technically illegal after 1850, because you have the fugitive slave law that ends up being enacted shortly after with the Compromise of 1850 that basically says that state governments in the North as well must help. And, well, not necessarily the state governments, but the federal government has a derelict duty that they have to actually assist Southerners in the recapture of runaway slaves. And this pertains to state governments under federal authorization. And many of the northern states are not for this after 1850. This is part of the reason why the Compromise of 1850 ends up falling apart, because while there were many things that made the South mad, such as the admission of California as a free state, they were also the things that made the North mad, such as they were not really willing to go ahead with this fugitive slave law and willingly be forced to have to send slaves back to their masters who they were running away from. And this had persisted for many years. In 1860, when the Lemon slave case came up in New York and was decided in favor that New York is going to say now that although this law is in effect, we are not going to adhere to it because we're now saying that if a runaway slave, not a runaway slave, but if any person is transferring a slave through the state of New York, so let's say a Southerner is on a business trip up to New York City. Beforehand, since they came from the South, the slave was their property. There was nothing the state of New York could do, even because that slave wasn't technically a runaway. It was simply being brought on as luggage. I mean, I hate to say it in that kind of a term, but that would be what they would classify it as. So what the state of New York is now saying in regards to this is if you bring a slave, even if it's not a runaway slave, so say a Southerner comes up to business in New York and brings their slave with them, just by the fact that you're bringing them into a free state, that slave is now going to be free, which is also kind of in defiance of the earlier Supreme Court case of Dred Scott, where they had argued that Dred Scott had argued that he was a free man because his master had brought him into a free state for a time and lived there for a time, and that made him free. And the Supreme Court said, well, no, you're not free because technically you shouldn't even have a hearing here because you're not a citizen of this country. But this ruling in the Lemon slave case in New York pretty much only served to agitate even further the divide that was really occurring between the abolitionist North and the Southern slaveholding South that absolutely was determined to hold its slaves under any condition. So Arthur is going to be the person that pretty much decides this case, and he ends up winning it in 1860, just on the eve of the Civil War. Mind you, the secession crisis will begin that December, with South Carolina seceding from the Union after the November 1860 presidential election, which Abraham Lincoln got elected. Arthur joins the anti-slavery Republican Party right around that time, right on the dawn of the Civil War coming up. And Arthur ended up becoming a member of the New York State Militia in the late 1850s, but he never actually saw combat. For him, during the Civil War, he was quartermaster for New York during the war, and that meant he was responsible for organizing food and supplies for the soldiers that were being sent south to fight the war in the battlefields down south. So he did serve during the Civil War in some sort of a military role, just not in a combat role. In 1871, President Grant named Arthur the customs collector for the Port of New York City. This was partly because of political connections that Arthur had, and Grant kind of played on that a little bit because of the factor that the spoil system is still in place. And the spoil system really comes into play in Arthur keeping that job because the prominent patronage system and political boss known as Roscoe Conkling, who we kind of discussed in the last video, he was the prominent U.S. Senator from New York at the time, and he actually helped Arthur to obtain that job from President Grant. He had kind of lobbied President Grant to give Arthur this job based out of the fact that, oh yeah, I know him. He's a very promising attorney. He'd make a very good appointment for this position, even though, in all hindsight, Arthur probably didn't have all that much experience in the process of running a customs house, being a legal lawyer. Arthur controlled roughly 1,000 employees at his new job and gave many of the jobs to Conkling supporters in return for the appreciation for Conkling landing him the job with the president. So it's basically saying, okay, you got me the job, so I'll go ahead and I'll make sure that these 1,000 jobs I have to fill, I'll try to hire a majority of your supporters, whether or not they're qualified to work here or not. And as a further consequence of the spoil system, not only were these men that were hired mostly Conkling supporters, but they also shared part of their salaries with the Republican Party, which then used that funding for running party campaigns and fundraising events and everything else. So this was the spoil system at its worst, and Arthur was a product of the spoil system in terms as a politician. That is what he used to gain political power in New York. So, as we discussed about 2 videos ago, President Hayes actually ousted Arthur from his job in 1878, so he's right after Grant. And in 1878, he ousts Arthur from that job in an effort to reform the New York Customs House and the spoil system, but as we know, Hayes, due to the way that Congress was running at the time, being the most politicians were against him, really did not pursue any kind of civil service reform during his one term in office. And this was really the only way that Hayes had any impact on the situation, was by ousting Arthur from the New York's customs collector position that Grant had given him. Other than that, he really wasn't able to do much. That brings us to 1880. Hayes did not run for re-election that year, as we know, and the party was deadlocked at the National Convention over two different candidates, and this is pretty much a rehash from the last video, because Garfield was really the one who won this election. So we had Ulysses S. Grant, who was one of the main candidates that the party couldn't decide on. They would not decide possibly on nominating him for a third term in office. And then you had the prominent Speaker of the House, the representative from Maine, James G. Blaine. When moderate Republican James Garfield was nominated on the 36th ballot, Arthur was selected as Garfield's running mate to balance the ticket, because since Arthur was a product of the spoils system and was kind of seen as a little bit more attractive to the stalwart conservative faction of the party that was all for keeping the spoils system in place, it kind of balanced the ticket off that they would also support Garfield for the nomination, as long as his running mate was somebody that they could agree with and get along with. They ended up winning that election, as we obviously know, in 1880, and Arthur was sworn in as vice president on March 4th of 1881 on Inauguration Day. Garfield, unfortunately, ended up being shot by an assassin on July 2nd at a train station in Washington, D.C. by the assassin Charles Guiteau, and he ended up succumbing to the infections and other health problems that came from the wound eventually about 2 months later on September 19th. So Arthur ended up being sworn in as president early on the morning of September 20th, and I believe it was at his house. I do not believe he was in D.C. at the time. I believe he was back home in New York, and when he got the news that Arthur had died and that he was now president of the United States. This right here is an image of what the New York's Customs House, the merchant, looked like in New York, the merchant exchange in New York, of where Arthur was the head customs collector and had over 1,000 employees under him. This is where he operated from when he was working with the spoils system, really for political gain. And then here we have a depiction of the moment when Arthur is at his house in New York and he ends up being sworn in as President of the United States once upon learning the death of Garfield back in D.C. So that brings us to Arthur's presidency, which was really Garfield's presidency, but now Arthur's going to have to do most of it since Garfield was only in office for like 6 months. So this whole term that they got elected to, Arthur's going to have to finish out. So Arthur, and this was perhaps why I don't understand Arthur not being remembered as fondly as he should be, because he did a very astonishing move upon taking office and a very big turnaround that honestly gives a lot of merit to the man, really, unlike some of his predecessors who had assumed office after presidential deaths or assassinations. Arthur, despite having risen to power through machine politics and through using the spoils system, he actually surprised everybody by actually supporting civil service reform in the wake of Garfield's assassination. Not Garfield. Arthur had realized the spoils system had been a major contributor as to why Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, had purportedly shot the president. He realized it was a corrupt system, and although I have personally benefited from it myself in the past, I am willing to admit it needs to be fixed, it needs to be reformed, and I am willing to help you go along with that because now it's cost us the life of a president. Allegedly. I mean, the man was insane, but he did use the pretext that Garfield had not given him a political job and was somehow ignoring him. He was termed as a disgruntled office seeker. And this surprised everybody. This especially aggrieved the conservative stalwart faction in the Republican Party, which included Arthur's former boss, Roscoe Conkling, who pretty much were like, this was our man. This was the reason we nominated him to be the running mate, and now he has flipped 180 from the position that we had established back in the 1880 presidential election, and now he has flipped 180 and said that he will pursue civil service reform, much like Garfield had been planning to before his assassination. In January of 1883, Arthur signed what is perhaps his most significant landmark achievement during his tenure as president. In January of 1883, he ended up signing into law the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This mandated that government jobs be distributed based on merit and not political connections. You had to have the qualifications to get a job. If you went into if you had to get a job with the, say, nowadays, we're going to use modern day examples. Say you wanted to get a job with the IRS. Well, you would have to have proper qualifications, be that a college degree or background or employment certifications, licenses, or whatever to serve in that job that would be obtained. Say you want to serve as postmaster. Well, you're going to have whatever licenses or whatever qualifications the government says you need to have. It's not just, well, I voted for you in the last election. I should get postmaster of, you know, Toledo, Ohio. Well, did you have this qualification? No, I don't, but I voted for you. Well, that's not how this works anymore. It would also forbid employers from firing workers for political reasons, and it ended the compulsory political donations from employees, such as when Arthur had been the New York City customs collector, and he had made sure that every one of the employees that was under his control, that a portion of their salaries was being donated to the Republican Party. That is also ended at this point. So it officially ends the spoil system that has been in place since the time of Andrew Jackson, that has rapidly during the 1870s and 1880s become a valid issue of concern, and now it has unfortunately taken the death of an American president for action to finally be taken on this concretely. It also established a bipartisan civil service commission to help enforce the law. Arthur would also try to lower tariffs and support immigration during his term in office. He vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which would suspend Chinese immigration for 10 years. However, Congress overrode his veto, and the law went into effect anyway. So Chinese immigrants were banned from entering the United States for a period of a decade. They could not enter from 1882 until at least 1892. They were the only, Irish immigrants can come through, Mexican immigrants, Canadian, wherever else, except Chinese, because there was the fear in the West Coast that Chinese immigrants were taking up all the jobs. And in some ways, they were taking up jobs because they were willing to work for much lower wages. They were just happy to have a job and make a living. And this was a very racist and discriminatory way of trying to say, well, you're taking all the jobs because we're lazy, so we're just going to ban you. But yet, then we're going to complain that people still won't do the job. kind of like today in some ways. I hate to say it like that, but it's also true. I mean, out here near where I live, we have a lot of muck farms, is what we call them. But we have a lot of muck farmers that work in what we call the muck. It used to be like old wetland swamp. And every summer we have a lot of migrant workers who come up from Texas and Mexico and come out and work. And there's a lot of, I know, local hesitation, a lot of local and sometimes anger toward the fact that some of these people have been caught as undocumented and illegal immigrants. But at the same time, I kind of look at it as, well, the work that they're doing now, are you honestly telling me that if we sent them all back like you're wanting to, are you honestly going to tell me that you're going to pitch in and you're going to do the hard work in the fields that they're doing, the manual labor? Are you going to pitch in and do it? Well, no, I'm not going to do it. Well, who do you think is? No one's going to do it. That's why the farmers are willing to hire them, because they're willing to do it. I just love how American people think at times. They don't really think things through. But Arthur would try to support immigration. Unfortunately, he got overrode on that particular issue. He would also try to fight fraud in the Postal Service and also argue for the modernization for the Navy, which would actually begin under his term. The modernization of the U.S. Navy would start under Arthur's presidency and continue very rapidly up through World War II from that point. Because after the Civil War, the Navy and military as a whole had largely been shrunk because the United States is no longer at war. And by Arthur's presidency, by the early 1880s, the United States has actually got one of the smallest militaries in the world compared to its size. And Arthur kind of recognizes this, and he recognizes the great powers of Europe still have large militaries, and in particular, they still have very large navies. In some cases, they're starting to build large navies. And he started arguing, maybe we need to at least, I'm not saying we need to do better than them, but we at least need to be on par. So why don't we start with the Navy? We have a very large amount of coastline on two oceans. We need to have a Navy to defend it. Arthur, to his guests, became known for his sartorial style and his tastes for fine furnishings in particular. In fact, during his presidency, Arthur also renovated the White House, and he also supposedly owned over 80 pairs of pants. I don't know how many pairs of pants you can go through in a week's time, but to the point that you could think you had to have 80? That's a little egregious. Around 1882, Arthur actually learned that he was suffering from something that we call Bright's disease, which was a non curable kidney ailment, which more often than not ended up being fatal. And because of this, he would keep it secret from the public. Arthur never came out publicly that he had Bright's disease. He didn't want it to be a public matter. But at the same time, his health also started to decline because of the disease toward the end of his term of office. And because of that and other reasons, Arthur decided he was not going to run for re-election in 1884 and decided against doing so. James G. Blaine ended up being nominated as the Republican nominee in the 1884 election, and he ended up actually losing that election to the Democrats' nominee, Grover Cleveland, who will, when we get back to our next presidents, he'll be the next guy that we discuss because he is also rather unique among the presidents for another reason. So Arthur eventually says, okay, my health's failing. There's some other more personal issues that I don't want to discuss that are causing me to really think that a second term's really not up my alley. So I'm not going to run for re-election in 1884. So here's a portrait of Arthur's wife. This was Ellen, or Nell, as they like to call her. They ended up having 2 or 3 children together, and unfortunately, she died in 1880, just before he had become president. So his sister ended up filling in the role as First Lady during his tenure. This is a picture of Arthur around the time that he had taken office. Excuse me. And then here we have a picture of some of the first naval ships that were part of the modernization of the U.S. Navy after Arthur kind of worked on getting that started. We have some of the first 4 naval ships that really start being made after the orders go out from President Arthur that we need to really start having a strong Navy again. We need to start building up our Navy so that we can defend our coasts. And then right here we have our picture, and this one is a little odd. We have a picture here of Arthur on a hunting trip in New York. He was very much an outdoors man. He liked to be an outdoorsman. Arthur's right here sitting. And in the same picture, if we look up here to Arthur's, I guess in his perspective, it would be his right, his upper right. Right here, this is Robert Todd Lincoln. This is Abraham Lincoln's only surviving child at that point. This is in the 1880s. Robert Lincoln, out of the 4 kids that the Lincolns had, and him and Mary ended up having, only one ended up surviving into adulthood pretty much, and that was Robert. Robert was the eldest, and I believe he died in 1922. And he also had a habit somehow of some creepy way of being present at a lot of historical assassinations, as he had been a Secretary of War later on, and he had been present for his father's death, of course, because he was called to the Peterson house that night after Ford's Theater, after the shooting there. He was actually at the train station with Garfield when Garfield was shot. And then in 1901, he was also in line to meet President McKinley when McKinley ended up being shot by another assassin that had come up. So Robert Todd Lincoln unfortunately had the very unfortunate circumstance of being present for at least 3 out of the 4 presidential assassinations that have occurred in American history. But here he is with President Arthur, surprisingly, in this picture. So Arthur would leave office. Chester Arthur left office on March 4th of 1885. He would return to New York City to resume his legal career shortly after leaving office. So Arthur decides very quickly, I'm just going to go back to doing what I do for whatever remaining time I have left, as we have to remember at this point his health is deteriorating because of Bright's disease. and his health continued to deteriorate further for the following year after him leaving office. Eventually, he ended up passing away on November 18th of 1886, just roughly about a year and a half after leaving office at the age of 57 while he was at home. Following his Manhattan funeral, Arthur was buried next to his wife at Albany Rural Cemetery in Menands, New York, which is near Albany. Now, he has a rather simple grave from the pictures that I've seen of it. It's not dramatic in any way. It kind of just, unless you know what you're looking at or go right up to it or know where to look for it, you probably couldn't tell. It's not like when you go to the cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, which I've been to, and you go in there and Lincoln's tomb, it looks like a mini monument you'd find in Washington, D.C., honestly. It stands out. You can tell, oh, that's where Lincoln's buried. When you go see some of the other presidents' tombs, like Garfield in the cemetery that he's in Cleveland, which I've also gotten to see, his definitely sticks out. The cemetery of McKinley definitely sticks out. It actually kind of reminds me of a mini national mall, the way they got his set up. But Arthur's doesn't really stand out unless you go there and you know where he's at. I mean, once you get to it, it does say President of the United States, but other than that, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to tell discreetly just by looking outside the cemetery that there's a president buried there. And I think that in large part also kind of reflects how the American people have remembered Arthur, because he's not definitely been a president, I feel, that a lot of Americans remember right off the bat, because they just don't deem he did all that much important. But this is also the man that was responsible for turning 180 upon gaining office, where he had been a product of the spoils system and of machine politics, and yet he flipped 180 upon taking the office of president and was willing to sign the Pendleton Civil Service Act that officially ended the troublesome spoil system once and for all. So that concludes for Chester Arthur. Again, because of just how him and Garfield's present term ended up working out, they're not particularly long. Grover Cleveland, when we do him, will be a little longer because he is a two-term president, except a very odd two-term president because of how it worked out. But he will definitely be a little longer than Arthur is and Garfield. So when we get to that in June, we'll get to that. So that concludes for this video and for this week. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any suggestions, feel free to put them in the comment section below and I'll get through to them as soon as I possibly can. So that I do not believe I have anything exclusively set for next week. I have an idea what I want to cover, but I'm still thinking on it, so we'll see what it actually ends up coming out to. So unless anyone has any of those, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for next week's video.